lethal substances, like cigarettes. And so why are the tobacco companies turning to export? The reason is because smoking during this period was declining in the United States. In fact, it was declining in an interesting way. It was becoming class-related. When a use of substances becomes class-related, it typically gets criminalized. That's a long history of this. Prohibition was like this. In the 1980s, among more educated sectors, smoking declined. It was part of a lifestyle change, like everything declined. The use of, red meat, alcohol. I mean, across the board, lots of substance use declined, including cigarettes, including, incidentally, marijuana. So the peak use of marijuana in the United States was around 1979, but that was a low point for criminalization. The reason was folks like you, children of rich parents, and you don't send them to jail. In fact, you can't because they'll prevent it in various ways. So use was very high, criminalization was very low. In the 1980s, the use of all these substances, including tobacco, declined, and criminalization went way up. Didn't happen. It sort of happened even for tobacco. The way it happens there is big liability, indemnity suits in courts and so on. The cigarette companies, and now, the prisons are overflowing with drug-related so-called crimes, mostly victimless, because the people you're going after are poor. So that's okay. You can toss them in jail. In fact, it's a good idea. About 10 or 15 years ago, it was predicted by, the guys who write the legal history of prohibition and so on. It was predicted that cigarette smoking will become illegal in the United States because it's class-related, pretty much class-related. And that's what's been happening. So the companies are getting huge lawsuits, and Philip Morris has ads all over the place telling you how the Philip Morris people are helping distribute food to starving people and children and so on and so forth. And in order to compensate for this, the cigarette companies, which could see it coming, I mean, they read the statistics, started exporting cigarettes to mostly to the third world. And there's where it becomes extremely important to use the weapon of free trade to ram those doors open so we can send our lethal substances to them and make a profit from it. Same thing happened with, for example, lead. Lead was known to be toxic back in 1920, but it was kept in gasoline simply by legal shenanigans and paying off politicians and stuff for around 50 years. Finally, it was made illegal in the United States, and the lead exports went way up to the third world, so they still use tetraethyl lead in gasoline and so on. Same thing's happening with cigarettes. Well, these are some of the outcomes of actual trade. Cigarette transactions really are trade. I mean, unlike what happens in the automobile industry. And it's going up real fast, and the welfare outcomes you can see. I mean, let me just end with this. There's a ton more to talk about. But, freedom of movement of capital and what's called trade, misleadingly, have become sort of theological doctrines, as if they're goods in them, they're values in themselves. They're like values that must be preserved. But these things aren't values. I mean, there's nothing good or bad about trade. I mean, whether trade is good or bad depends on its outcomes. Like if the trade happens to be trade in cigarettes, it's horrible. It's like trade in the capacity to kill people, millions of people in this case. If the trade helps people, which it often does, then it's fine. But trade is no value, quite apart from the fact that most of what goes on isn't trade. As for mobility of capital, that's been definitely harmful. As I said, it's had major effects on the economy, most of which have been harmful. Now, is there a chance for a new international economic order? Well, sure, why not? These are not laws of nature, they're not laws of history. I mean, what's the sort of line is there's no alternative. It's kind of a parody of Marx's iron laws of history. It just has to happen. You're kind of like a tidal wave, you can't stop it. And that's total nonsense. These are, you trace them back, it's human decisions of the powerful states made with particular interests in mind. There are alternative decisions that can be made all along the way. These questions are all up for grabs. Nobody should be misled by the idea that there is a thing, globalization, which somehow is inevitable. There's various kinds of international integration. They've taken different forms over the years. They can take different forms tomorrow. They're maybe good, maybe bad. You can measure that in terms of their outcomes, and it's up. In principle, there's no reason whatsoever why populations can't make these decisions. Okay. That's my half hour. Sorry, I talked so long. I should have told you to interrupt me. Yeah.
Just, you mentioned how in developed countries, or even in Mexico, how, or the golden, whatever you call this, age of growth, or in Mexico, you said how the economy, the macroeconomic numbers are growing, but
not as the way they were before. So here's another standard lie that's told. There's a thing called ISI, import substitution industrialization. It means countries try to protect their own industries and have internal industrial production, substituting their own production for imports. Now economists will tell you that's inefficient, and by some measure it's inefficient. Every industrialized country got that way by you doing this. If the U.S. hadn't done this, we'd be exporting fur, which was our comparative advantage in 1820 or something. But because the U.S. set up very high tariffs to block British textiles, and later extremely high tariffs to block better British steel, and so on, it was possible to develop domestic industry. Well, ISI was the policy that was followed by most of the third world up until around 1980, when they had to stop it under the threat of the concocted debt trap. If you look, it's claimed that that was inefficient, and in an abstract model of the world, it is inefficient. In the actual world, it was highly effective. So Mexican growth rates, to take Mexico, were much higher during the ISI period than they've been in the Liberalization period.
In regards to, let's say, Canada and the U.S., like when Peter Jennings, or in Canada, Lloyd Robertson go on the nightly newscast and say, last year the economy grew by 3%.
Whose economy?
Like Canada and whatever, we're all supposed to jump up and cheer, but
except,
I'm wondering if even...
Look, in the 1950s, it was running at 5 and 6%. That's the 50% decline that they're talking about.
I'm wondering if even that so-called 3% increase in GDP that year is artificial in itself, because, like, the privatization, like, vertically of society in terms of privatizing healthcare, telecommunications, education, water treatment, prisons, power plants, like, were those things, before they were privatized at such a large scale, were they factored into the GDP, or now are they
probably
artificially injected?
No, they should have. I mean, if people were counting right, they should have been figured. GDP, remember, it's a measure of something, but it's an ideological measure. I mean, there are a lot of ways to increase GDP. For example, my wife was driving last night and hit a pothole and wrecked a wheel in a car. Okay, that increases GDP because she's got to go to the garage and get them to fix the tire and maybe buy a new wheel and pay the mechanic and pay somebody to build them. So that increases GDP quite a lot. In fact, there was actually a study by the Department of Transportation trying to compare the cost of fixing the roads with the cost to people of not fixing the roads. And it turned out the cost of not fixing the roads was, I forget the number, but like roughly 1.5 times as high as fixing the roads. On the other hand, fixing the roads harms the economy because that's public expenses, whereas transferring the cost to individuals helps the economy because that increases GDP. Now, these are not jokes. I mean, that's the way the thing works across the board. So like pollution increases GDP. For one thing, because then it costs a lot of money to get rid of the consequences. And also people get sick. And when they get sick, they go to doctors. and you pay the doctors, and you have to build a hospital, and so on and so forth. All of that increases GDP. I mean, GDP is something, but, you know, it's not wholly. It's an ideological measure. You can think of different measures, which, like social indicators, say, which will give you a different picture of what's happening. But these numbers should have been counted in GDP if it was done right.
And how did the U.S. compel South Korea to open up its financial market?
Look, when the biggest thug on the block tells you to do something, you do it. For example, if the U.S. were to put some constraint on South Korean exports to the United States, the country would go down to 2. The actual method that was used was South Korea wanted to join the OECD, the rich men's club, you know, the rich country. And the condition that the U.S. imposed was they can do it if they liberalize financial markets. Liberalizing financial markets, what it means in the real world is the U.S. takes over the economy, running the economy, because the U.S., what they call services, you know, like banks and insurance companies and all that stuff, so totally overwhelms the rest of the world that if the markets are opened up, they take it over. That's what's going to happen in China, probably. You know, in fact, that's one of the reasons the U.S. is so much in favor of the latest agreement. It's going to, if the Chinese allow it, you know, if they follow the rules, it will allow U.S. financial institutions to essentially take over planning the Chinese economy. And what happened in South Korea is when they opened markets, it led to a tremendous amount of unconstrained capital flowing in, way more than they could absorb, and then it all sort of flowed out suddenly and, you know, get a crash. Taiwan didn't liberalize markets, and it didn't have a crash. In fact, the countries that did not suffer the Asian collapse much were China, Taiwan, and India, all 3 of which had refrained from opening up financial markets. You know, again, like I said before, nobody really understands what's going on anywhere, but that's at least some evidence suggesting that opening up the markets was a big factor in the crash, which I think most economists believe. You know, some true believers don't accept it. But actually, there's a real good book on this, incidentally. Robin Hannell has a short, readable, terrific South End book, it may be over there, called Panic Rules, which goes through a lot of this stuff in very readable and, you know, fashion and very expertly. So, yeah.
Can you comment on the somewhat recent events in Ecuador, maybe its presentation to the press? From what I saw, Ecuador defaulted on its loans. In the press, I didn't see really incorporation of that history. And maybe what, if you know.
Well, yeah. I mean, Ecuador has been following neoliberal policies. It had a collapse. There was an indigenous revolt, which essentially forced the new government in. Under what amounted to a fraud, the military managed to take over and return something like the old government. Big defeat for the indigenous movements. The indigenous population is huge in Ecuador, which had driven the thing through. The reasons for the revolt were the usual ones. I gave some statistics for the United States, but in the third world it's the same, except much worse. You know, like if the proportion of the population that suffers is much greater, and the suffering is much greater. So, like if incomes stagnate in the United States, well, you know, not a human tragedy. If they stagnate or decline in a place like Ecuador, it's a real human tragedy. You need, you know, water to drink, you know, that sort of thing. Ecuador is now, I suppose, you know, nobody knows exactly what's going to happen. It's a country with a lot of resources, like it has oil, for instance. But it's part of this Andean system, all of which is in turmoil. I mean, all of it. Bolivia, Ecuador, Peru, Colombia, that whole region is in great turmoil. And what's happening now is that the U.S. looks as though it's gearing up for a big counterinsurgency campaign, and maybe worse, in that whole region. The Ecuadorian army, for what it's worth, is releasing sort of press leaks claiming the U.S. is building a big military base in Ecuador, a place called Manta, and they're claiming, I don't know if it's true or not, that what the U.S. is planning is a kind of Kosovo-style war to try to, you know, heavy bombing, that kind of thing, to try to crush the growth of guerrilla forces and others that are growing out of the socioeconomic inequities and oppression there. I mean, all this stuff has nothing to do with drugs, it's transparent. But drugs are kind of cover the way the Cold War used to be. And that's possible. I mean,